Coming up on the Minute the Movies podcast, I talk with Lee Dickerson, who plays Malchus in the upcoming short film Shema. He discusses his story, how he got into the creative business, but also how he walked into church and God transformed his life. We talk about fatherhood, the importance of healthy families, and the most important thing is anything can be redeemed.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being.
Hello and welcome to the Minute the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and before I introduce Lee, I just wanted to say, I'm really excited to talk to him. If you listened to our last podcast with Chris, you'll know some of what he's doing because Lee plays Malchus in the upcoming film Shema. So thanks to Sarah for setting this up, for introducing us. But I'm really excited because over the last several months, and you'll hear this moving forward, I've had the opportunity to actually meet and talk with some filmmakers and guys in the industry. I'm super excited to bring those people on and talk about their story, their passion, what got them into the business. But today I'm super excited to talk to Lee Dickerson, who's, where are you from?
I'm from Massachusetts originally, but I'm living in New Hampshire.
Living in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Friend of Sarah, goes to her church. And so, Lee, thanks for coming on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And that's a wrap.
All right. See you later.
That's it. And so I wanted to kick off, start with sort of the impetus that got you on here. Sarah had... she's like, hey, I know these guys who are making this short film, Shema, about the story of Malchus, the temple servant whose ear Peter cut off in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
So, and you're playing Malchus in the upcoming short film.
I am. Yeah.
And so, let's start with that, and then we'll dive into your story on as we continue. So how did you get connected with this project?
So when I was going to college, I went to college. Well, I changed my major multiple times. I never really knew what I wanted to do.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
I wanted to do something involving, whether it was video or journalism. It was basically journalism and broadcasting was the beginning. And then I switched it over as I went to a different college and just focused on radio and video production and broadcasting. During that time, I did an externship at the place where Chris was working. He was one of the directors or producers there. And we seemed to get along for the most part. I wasn't a Christian. He was, I think, by family, not like he was walking with it at the time, but, we all kind of have our rumspringa, if you will. And so I don't know if we kept in touch back then, if it was Facebook then, or I found him later on and I added him. But I noticed about a year or so ago that he was doing like these missions trips out to Israel. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. And being a new believer myself, I was like, oh, that's cool. I'm glad that we're friends on Facebook. So I noticed that he was putting up this thing. He basically mentioned, I'm looking to do a short film inspired by The Chosen. And I'm like, I don't even have to read the rest. Like, whatever you're doing, like, if you're nearby, like, let me be a part of it any way you can. And, I love being behind a camera. I actually did live event production for a while for a job. It just... my knees can't handle it like they used to, and climbing up towers and rigging stuff up just wasn't for me. Plus, I was never around to see my family. So I stepped back for a while. So I'm like, okay, something like this was really what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in the studio. No, it's not so much the live events. And leaving that job was one of the best things for me. But also having it was great. It was a great experience.
Right.
But so Chris he was looking for somebody, and I said, hey, let's get together. So we got together, found out that neither of us really, like, we're not the type of person who needs coffee in the morning. Like some people just, they can't start their day without their coffee. So we met at a coffee shop, and we both just decided to have a Diet Coke instead. So he's just like, yeah, I'm not really. He's like, where's this thing where we all have to have coffee when we meet up? I'm like, I don't know. I'm fine with the Diet Coke. I don't care if it's 7 a.m. Diet Coke works for me. So we talked, shared the story back and forth, and he's just like, why don't you just send me an audition? And I'm like, I mean, I can, I wasn't really looking to do that, but if you need actors and you haven't landed anybody yet, then sure, let's do it. So I did an audition video maybe 3 days later, and I went to bed, and I was like, I really don't like how that went. Like, I could have done something else. So the next morning I got up and I tried a different focus on the accent. Because I was really kind of following like a Jonathan Rumi thing where it's very easy to understand kind of in the higher register as I normally speak, as opposed to something like, what are you doing? You cannot do this. So I found some kind of happy medium in between to still put the accent in there, thicker, but yet very easy to understand. And I sent it to him, and he was blown away by it and said, I kind of want to give you the role right now. I'm like, no. If I'm the first audition you received, please, like, I want to see this go. Even if I have nothing to do with the project, I want to see you do something. I want to see this come together in a way that's really going to like carry on a little bit from what The Chosen's doing and reach a new audience. So after maybe 3 weeks to a month, he just officially said, okay, you're my Malchus. So let's just, get over that and get used to it. And then from there, things continue to just fall into place, and it's been an amazing project to be a part of so far. We shot a short teaser. Not sure if you've seen it, but we shot that in maybe like between setup, doing it, and breakdown, maybe an hour and a half out in the woods. And it was very cold. I was very wet, covered in fake blood. And he's just like, you sure you want to do this? I'm just like, hey, pain is temporary, film is forever. Let's do this. And I'm like taking off my shoes because I didn't have any sandals, and, just like wetting my hair to make it look like I was in a tussle. And I'm like, quick, rub dirt all over my face because it'll look good. And he's just like, are you serious? I'm like, yeah. He's got a camera in one hand and dirt rubbing all over in the other. And it was a great experience. And, like I'm definitely one where if we're going to do this and if it's going to be caught on film, go all in. Like if you have to really punch me in the stomach, really punch me in the stomach. It'll look better. I'll get over it. Just, don't break an artery or something, or, puncture an organ. So yeah, that's pretty much how I got into it. And then from there, like I said, things have been falling into place. We've been getting people who are donating costumes. We've had a lot of people we've reached out to, just to see if they'd want to be in it. Some people did some really great interviews or auditions, and some, they did it and were like, oh, we want to see more. And then they just kind of ghosted us. That's new. I don't know where that came from. I've never had it make that noise before.
It's a ghost in the machine.
Yeah. So, we've had some people who just, they never got us a second interview. So I was like, well, that really stinks because, you did a great job. We just wanted to see a little bit less staring at the phone and a little bit more, looking directly at us. So we ended up having to move on because we were getting close to our personal timeline for getting things, and we wanted to have a table read. The table read went well. We missed a couple of people, but we have some other dates that are set up for that. And we just landed. I mean, pretty sure we have like everybody we need now, which is great. By the time this episode airs, we'll have everybody in place, and we'll be a lot further along. But we got my old guitarist. He and I call him my old guitarist because it's the simplest way to explain our relationship. He and I have known each other for years. We were in a band together from 2004. We did it for like a year, and then we were in another band together for like 6 years. Then that broke apart, and then I ended up starting up a new band where I was leading it, and he came and was a part of that too. And so we played music together for many, many years. But as far as the friendship goes, like, because of a lack of us being on the same page with what the band was doing, there was a frustration there, and the other guys wanted to release him from the band, which is the nicest way to say it. And I was the only one who fought for him for about a year. And then finally I'm like, I can't back you up anymore. So there were a few years where he was bitter and was cordial with them, but still blamed me, even though I was the one supporting him, which I'm not blaming him now. There's absolute forgiveness now. So I reached out to him, and I know he has his personal beliefs about political stuff. He's very outspoken about his political beliefs, which are, we'll say, not aligning with mine. But I know that he understands the story of Jesus and Peter. And I said, hey, would you come audition for Peter? And he sent it over to Chris, and completely, I think his audition was better than mine. And I thought about it. Like, my only hesitancy was his difference in beliefs. I'm like, is this something that, you really want to do? Thinking of it from an art perspective. And he's like, yeah, I'm 100% down. I'm like, okay. And then, he met with Chris, and there we go. I mean, I can go on forever about this project, because there's so many little parts that came together that have blown my mind. But yeah, I'm excited to be working with him again. Giuseppe is one of my oldest and closest friends. Even if we don't see each other much anymore, even though he only lives 15 minutes away, we still keep in touch when we can. Hey, how are you? How are the kids? But I'm happy to be working with him in a project again.
Even though he's going to cut your ear off.
Even though he's going to cut my ear off. And the thing is, I've seen him overreact. And when I thought about, like, who do I know who could play somebody very over emotional? And I'm like, oh, of course, Giuseppe would nail this. And as a joke, so I've got on video. We were a long time ago. This must have been 2006. He was on the phone having an argument with one of his parents. And while he was doing that, everybody was being obnoxiously loud and like making noises on the microphone. And then, to be funny, we thought it would be funny to follow him around like it was the crocodile hunter. And like, now, if you look here, you see an angry Giuseppe. You don't want to get too close. And then we sneak up behind him. And then he grabbed a 2-wheel dolly and threw it at me. He didn't hit me. Like, I ducked. And it's all on video. And it's and all we just go and walk away. So I thought about that. I'm just like, man, this guy could totally come and cut my ear off.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's going to come together. I'm pretty pumped.
That's awesome. And so, this episode's going to air on April 1st, the very last day of the Kickstarter. So if you're listening to this on April Fools, go check it out. Go help support this film. And if it's after April 1st, then you're just out of luck, and you're just going to have to wait to be a part of it later on.
Yep.
But you can go check out their website, refocuscreative.com/Shema is how you would say it if you're American. SHEMA. You would actually say Shema is the way to say it, the proper way to say it. But go, if you want to, for updates, that's where you go. Sign up for their mailing list, and you'll get all the updates on the movie as they do it. Follow them on the Instagram. I said TikTok too, I think.
Oh.
And all those links will be in the show notes so that you can go be a part and see when this is coming out, and even maybe see some behind the scenes shots as they're actually filming over the summer.
Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned earlier that when you met Chris, you were in college, you were doing the externship, and he was working and all, but he was possibly a believer, but you definitely were not.
I was definitely not. No, 100% not.
So I'm super interested. What is some of that backstory? Like, tell me about what got you even to that point where you met up with Chris.
Where I met up with Chris?
Yeah, like basically, let's dip back into your childhood and how you even got there.
Yeah. So my mother and father loved each other very much.
And then one day a baby was born.
One day, a stork came in. That's not how it goes. Yeah. So I will say that my parents were, my father was Catholic. My mother was take it or leave it. Like, I'll go because my husband goes. I'll go because my mother wants me to go, type thing. And that's pretty much that. So I was baptized as an infant, against my will. And that's a conversation I've had to have with my father multiple times in the past decade. Like, I know it already happened, but like, I didn't choose it. You just shoved me in the water. So we, my parents, raised me as they could. I don't think we went every single Sunday, but again, I was 5 by the time my parents separated. And when that happened, my mother and we moved a town away. which was actually a peninsula. It was basically an island. It was connected by a little causeway, and we weren't too far. However, my father was far, like just relationally. I wanted to be with him a lot, but he was trying to figure out his life and what he wanted to do, and unfortunately, our relationship kind of fell by the wayside over the years. And let's see, how do we get through it? My mother was with a few other people. One other guy in particular who was my dad's best friend for a while.
Oh,
and so he kind of came into the picture to be like a new father to me, and I did not want to accept that, even though he got me involved in scouts and a lot of father-son things. Since then, I mean, the thing is, like, I'm looking at everything as a parallel. And since then, that guy and he actually came up to my house a few years ago and we built a deck together. This past weekend, my father and I went away together for the weekend down to the Cape. He has a little timeshare down there. And these relationships have been fully restored since knowing Jesus. So it's kind of cool to go back and say, oh yeah, and then Jesus was here, and then he was here, and then all this. look at how God works. His hand is so much bigger than anything we can really imagine. And so over years went by, and I just kind of went off and did my own thing. I was my own God. I whatever seemed good at the time, I would just go ahead and do it. If it felt good, then it must be good. And that was my pretty much my motto for years. Met my wife at a party house. It was a reoccurring party. Like, basically, when you're not working, you go to the party house. You hang out, you smoke, you drink, you do other drugs and whatever. And at this point,
kind of like your 24/7 prayer you've got going at your church now, but for parties.
Yes, yeah. The code name for the place was Russia. So, not to give everything away now, I'm pretty sure that if any of those people are still there, there's a problem. I really hope they've grown up. But Russia with our code names, they're like, oh, we're gonna go to Russia. Oh, okay, Russia. We would never say the address in case somebody was listening. But anyway, long story short, I met my wife. I was on drugs, and she somehow saw through it and fell in love with me. And I saw through her, she was also on drugs. And I remember it was kind of amazing because we were hanging out. And I think my car was in the shop, or either way, she was the one who was driving. And we said, where are we going? She's like, oh, going to, she named her drug dealer's house. I'm like, oh, okay. Would you mind just dropping me off over at such and such? She's like, well, why? And I'm like, kind of wanted to hang out with you, not you on drugs, but it's no big deal. I can just call somebody else and get a ride if you're doing what you're doing. I didn't want to interfere with her stuff. And she immediately stopped right then and there. Her addiction that she had for years just ended because she realized, like, somebody loved her, and there was nothing that needed to interfere with that. So, like, that's just a cool part of our relationship. This was probably back in 2007 that we met, and we were together for about 5 or so years, and then we got married. And I think it was just actually, I graduated in the same year that we got married. So that year is when I went to college. And, I bumped into Chris, and it's just funny because I didn't think that the relationship with Chris was going to be so significant. I didn't think that we would catch back up, 10 years later or so, or however long it's been, almost 13 years later. Because it was just, I looked at it as it was a job, and they didn't end up hiring me later on because they had some other people who were more local, who were there more often, that went for certain positions. So I wasn't like, the top thing on their mind when they had a new position open up and be available.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, whatever, kind of wrote them off and moved on. But again, just like seeing how everything opened up here, was kind of cool. I mean, getting rocked.
Hang on.
Yeah.
So, were you still into the drugs during this whole time?
When I was in college?
Yeah, like after you said your wife gave up the drugs, like
I gave up.
Snap of the fingers.
I gave up the drugs. I didn't give up the drinking.
Gotcha.
So the drinking, there's a lot to it actually. It was legal. It was legal to drink. It wasn't legal to drink and drive. It wasn't legal to be in public. And being intoxicated. However, that wasn't the primary thing. It was like I'd come home from work, time to drink and play a game, or time to drink and watch a movie. But after a while, after we were married for about a year or so, we were in a really bad car accident. shooting a short film that I was working on. It was dumb. It was about a killer lawn gnome. And it's still up here on my shelf, and every now and again I look up at him and I'm like, oh yeah, you ruined my life. But we were driving down the Kankamangas, and there's a whole story about how we got up there, and there were all these roadblocks trying to stop us from making this project, but we're like, no, we're going to get this done. It was based off of a 5-minute short that I did in college and got an A+ on. And and actually Giuseppe, and I think about it, he was actually in that with me too. I totally forgot. And he was.
Well, the other interesting thing is with that project, all these roadblocks versus Shema, which is like everything's been opening up for you guys. Which,
exactly.
I find these parallels and contrasts interesting. So.
Yeah. Well, I always thought, back then I had the mindset of like, well, if there's all these challenges, these are just opportunities for me to learn how to overcome challenges. And maybe, I didn't not believe in God. I wasn't an atheist. I was, very agnostic, saying like, there's a God, and he's got a plan, but, nothing I'm doing is going to change that. So like it was, yeah, I don't know. I was thinking like, Terminator style, where it's like, no matter what happens, John Connor's got to die. That's the plan here or whatever. But yeah, I think, sorry, I forgot where we were going there with that. But
you're on the Kankamangas.
The Kankamangas. Yeah, it was rough. So the accident we had, my wife was in the back seat. I was in the front seat, and she was newly vegan, and she wasn't substituting certain foods for other foods. She was just omitting them. So her body was very fragile. And unfortunately, when we had the accident, pretty much everything the seatbelt touched shattered. Her collarbone, about 9 ribs. She broke her wrist, split her spleen, punctured her kidney, stress fracture in her spine. Like you name it, she was wrecked. She couldn't sleep in the bed for about 2 months. She had to sleep just like propped up in pillows on the couch. And yeah, it was my birthday week. So I remember I'm just like, well, happy birthday. My wife's up in a hospital, 2-3 hours away. And she told me to go home, and we didn't have a car. And oh yeah, that was the other thing, is trying to get to her in the hospital is my clutch burned out. So that was fun. I basically had to push my truck uphill to get to the hospital after driving 2.5-3 hours. It was not a fun experience, but all that to say, I guess they were roadblocks that God was purposely putting there, saying, just stop and listen, stop trying to do everything in your own strength. But at that point, my mind was like, no, it's a challenge, and we're supposed to rise to challenges. So all that being said, we've never fully physically recovered from that. However, the settlement that we got, it was my friend who was driving, and he was totally at fault. A bee flew in the car and started crawling up his shorts. It's the most ridiculous like movie scenario. And I handed him the middle of the folder that had all the scripts in it. And I'm like, here, like shoo it out. So he starts swatting at it and stomping on it. And while he's looking down, the road turns, but we keep going straight. Oh. And we were in a little Ford Fusion, and we found out why it's called a Fusion this day. Is because it went right into a Lincoln Navigator. And it was rough. So each car was going easily 55 each. So that was 110 mile per hour hit. And, there was a family in the other car. It was like a mother, father, and a little girl. She had a superficial cut on her forehead. Actually bumped into like the iPad in front of her or something. But my wife got hit the hardest. I broke a pinky, like I had a video camera on a tripod between my legs. And when the airbag went off, the bottom of the camera was still attached to the tripod, but the whole camera was like mangled and twisted up. And I'm like, man, if my hand didn't go up instinctively, I guess, because I don't remember the impact, it was so quick, that camera would have gone right through my face. So basically that just kind of stopped it. But yeah, anyway, crazy accident. We got the settlement. We put money aside. We paid off our student loans. We paid off all the, tens of thousands of dollars of medical bills, because she was even airlifted off the Kank, over to the hospital. And even it was funny, like even just the drive, I think the ambulance drove like a mile up the road. That was like $2,000 for the ambulance to drive her to the helicopter. This is crazy how much that, medical stuff costs. Yeah. And, so the few years after that were really rough. She was banged up. She started like getting heavy into conspiracy theories and just hating the world. And I was like, I don't want to deal with this. And I just started drinking more. And after about a year or so, I was just probably at one of the lowest points, and I was at the grocery store buying some more stuff to drink while I was already intoxicated as it was, and bumped into somebody from high school who was an acquaintance. Another person who I knew was a Christian, but wasn't really acting as one, but just said they were. And I'm like, okay, well, good for you. He says, why don't you come to church? I laughed it off and said, yeah, whatever. But then 2-3 days later, I walked in and was just amazed at the people that I met there, and just the presence of whatever was going on. Because at that point, I had no idea. And people were interested in knowing who I was, interested in actually having a conversation. Every church I've ever gone to, you walk in and people kind of size you up. They look at your shoes and what you're dressed in, and they go, And the only time you ever say anything is when you say, let's all show each other a sign of peace. Oh, peace, take your hand. And that was all I knew of church. It was very impersonal, very non-relational. But everything I saw at this congregation was super relational. And I was like, that's not what I thought church was. I had a pastor's wife that was a supervisor of mine at Blockbuster Video. One of the best jobs I've ever had, by the way. Except for the fact that this pastor's wife was she turned me off from anybody considered a Christian. I figured, I'm just like, well, if you're the wife of a pastor, isn't Jesus supposed to, demonstrate love and respect and honor and appreciation? And like, I kind of imagined that. But that's not what she did. She was very just like, she came in and she like goose stepped all over that place. And it was like, wow, this is really rough. So it turned me away further from ever considering Christianity. But, all that being said, I think looking at everything and recognizing where I've been is what makes it just makes the whole story come together. Having that parallel of like, this is where I was, this is where I am, and seeing like, wow, look how I go down, this is how I walk down the street now, as opposed to how I walked down before. This is how I connect with people now compared to how I connected before. My wife, for the first year and a half after I got rocked, was very against it. Very much hated, well, not hated, but didn't trust anybody in the church, those nosy people, blah, blah, blah. And then we ended up buying a house with some of the money we had saved. I put towards a down payment. And we moved next to somebody from church. It was an older couple from church, and she was so annoyed with how nosy this woman is. And it's funny because now she's our mentor. They don't even live next to us anymore. It's a condex, so we lived like abutted right up against them. But they've since moved, and we still have a very they're very much spiritual parents to us. But it took a year and a half or so, and my wife, she was at the end of her rope basically, and ready. She just hated the world, and she was ready to just like give it up. She's like, I don't care if I go right now. And she called up the neighbor next door. They read through Job, which I don't understand how it works, but I mean, Job would make me pretty depressed. Right. But she read through it and was totally rocked by it. And now, I wouldn't say she's the spiritual head of the house, but I'll say this: she's the first one to say we need to pray. She's the first one to say, like, hey, okay, and what did Jesus say about that? Like, I'll say she's better than I am at jumping to it right away. And it's amazing to see just such a dramatic transformation of like being so against everybody in the world, because, why wouldn't you if you see how bad the world ends up being? Right. And just, she's an evangelist. Like we had an evangelist come up 3-4 months ago, and she was like, this is what I've been looking for. I'm like, okay. And she's like, why don't you get out there? You got to go meet with him, and then you got to go out. And so I went out and did this thing. We're out at a mall, and we're just walking up to people. Hey, my name's Lee. Hey, if you died today, do you have, without shadow of a doubt, do you think you'd be in heaven? And like, oh, then we get into this whole conversation. But I'm just like, if you died today, I'm like, this is not my personality. I'm not the evangelist. Like one guy, I'm just like, hey, if this, and he's just like, I'm having a really bad day, man. Today's not the day. I'm like, well, today's might be the perfect day. And he's just like, leave me alone. And I'm like, okay.
You're about to get your ear cut off.
So, I mean, that's the nutshell of where we've been. I mean, since then we've been in leadership in the church. We've run ministries together. We were basically pastoring a small church out of our home for a while. I was leading a men's purity group for a while. I went through it for a few years, and then I ended up leading it with a few other friends. Actually, the friend that bumped into me at Market Basket that time, and said, "Hey, come to church." We've been pretty tight. He's one of the worship leaders now too. We've been, we're kind of teammates in many areas. But, we've been through a lot of stuff together, and then we realized the importance of, okay, it's good to be involved in the church community, but it's also really important to make sure we're focusing on our own personal family. Because if I'm so busy and I'm never with my kids, we're not going to have a healthy family. And healthy churches start with healthy families. So if you're going to have it's just like the obvious, cliche term of if you have a broken cog, the whole machine's not going to work. So we want to make sure that our cog is good. So in the middle of, actually just before our conversation, I was trying to find somebody else to cover me, officially, so I don't have to play bass on the fourth Sunday of the month, just so I can have a Sunday and a Monday to ourselves with the family.
Yeah.
But, I help run the video team there and the worship team, and, it's good to be involved. Recently just started, we started up a trail life, patrol, or troop, actually. So Trail Life is basically Christian Boy Scouts.
Oh, okay.
It's Boy Scouts without the gender confusion. Not to slam on Boy Scouts. I was a scout for a while, and there were really good things I learned from it. But I'm basically overseeing all the ones that are leading the 5 to 10-year-old boys. So that just started a few months ago. Last night we had a really great meeting, and it's fun. I wanted to give back to something that gave so much to me when I was a kid. And with me having daughters, I was like, well, it's a little different. The things that you can teach a boy who they're going to be excited about. Not to say my girls don't get excited about fixing things around the house sometimes, but we just have the 2 girls, and we're going to hopefully start up what's called Heritage Girls, which is the girls side of it. So we'll have joint meetings in the morning, and then we split off and do our own lessons. And I'm hoping that works out. There we go.
Awesome.
That's 27 minutes of me just going off.
Well, I thought it was interesting because you had talked before how you'd gotten into this leadership, how you really embraced getting into the church to the point that it was consuming your life, basically.
Yeah.
But this mindset of, you had mentioned this idea of being Superman, feeling like if there's a problem, I'll solve it. Exactly. Even going back to, I think that same mindset, right? Even when going through that project, no, these obstacles, they're not going to stop me. I'm going to push through it.
Right.
And I think, you had mentioned your wife being much more quickly to say, let's pray, let's go to Jesus about this. And you're like, I think part of it is our desire. I mean, I have the same thing, is like, oh, if there's a problem, I want to fix it.
Yeah.
And like, if I can, it eats away at me a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a very similar story when I went back to church, and after years, and God said, I'm so glad you're home, and just like embraced everything and got into small groups and leading men and doing this. And most nights of the week I was off doing something.
Yeah.
To the point I basically had a family intervention where they said, I feel like there's this chasm growing between us, and the name of the church is in the chasm.
Yeah.
Like it's pushing me apart from my family. And that's tough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, on the one hand, you're like, oh, this is awesome. This is where I found life. But then, like you said, you're like, well, if I'm ignoring my family, I'm sort of ignoring my first primary calling.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's something, actually, it came up in conversation. I went to go meet with my mentor yesterday morning, and I walked in, and he and his wife were, I wouldn't say arguing. We'll say they were having a spirited debate. And and a lot of it came down, like, I just walked in, like, it's kind of awkward. Like, 'cause I just kind of come in the house and I sit down and we start talking. And I walked in, and they were just not ready to end the conversation. So after about 25 minutes or so, he's like trying to get up and end the conversation without saying anything. She goes, excuse me, we're talking. And I'm like, and I'm just like, hey, if this is what God wants us to talk about today, I'll sit around and join the conversation. And what really came out of it is, there are some churches that focus purely on relationship. There are other churches that focus purely on evangelism and outreach and stuff like that. But trying to find a balance, is hugely important. And one of the struggles I had was we were pushing, not to say anything negative about our specific congregation, but we were pushing so hard, and we have to make sure we're doing this and we're doing these things. I'm just like, hold on, because there are families that are in crisis right now. And what's the point of bringing in new families when we've got our families right here that need attention? And that's I think that's a struggle that happens with a lot of different communities is where's that balance between moving forward and then protecting? So there's two different people when it comes down to like there's modal people and there's sodal people. I don't know if you've heard those terms, but basically,
I have not.
So there's people who are pastoral, that are very much shepherds, and they want to focus on the flock that's right there. And then there's the evangelistic and visionary type people who want to go out and expand. So there's the expansion of the kingdom, and then there's the fostering of what's already there. And it's funny because, my wife and I are different. I'm more modal and she's more sodal. But that's why we led our life group for a while, because I really wanted to pastor those that were there, because I saw so many people that were struggling, and I'm like, these people just need to connect. These people just need to hear truth and not just be going through the same cycle over and over again, saying like, oh, this is so tough for me. This is so tough for me. Like, well, did you give it to Jesus? There's a stressful situation here. And every time we get together, I'm like, hey, how are you? And I mean, I'll say it too. Like, if you would ask if I was optimistic or pessimistic, I'm definitely more on the pessimistic side than I am optimistic. And it's because I can easily forget as well. But, you kind of come to terms with reality and say, well, God's got this, stop worrying about tomorrow. He's already there. And I think, it's easy to follow into it, but we need more people who are going to feed the sheep that want to be fed. Feed the sheep we have. It doesn't make sense you got starving sheep here to run out and start like throwing it out to others and saying, hey, they might be hungry. So that's just a conversation that kind of came out of yesterday. And I feel strongly that, and I'm not saying anything bad about our congregation, because we do have a lot of, we have some new elders that were appointed. So we have 4 couples of elders, and it's great because you can just reach out. We have 2 that meet with us once a month, my wife and I, just to check in, see how things are going, so they can kind of be under us and make sure that we're focusing on each other in the way that's going to build our marriage stronger. And my wife and I, we both understand, we know that there's absolutely a calling that we're eventually going to be in that position, helping other marriages get through the stuff we've been through, because we've been on both sides. We've been, in the gutter, in the drug house, partying every single night and, doing whatever all day and skipping class and, shirking all the responsibilities. And then we were like, full on in, like all involved in church, all consumed by our community and our responsibilities. And then now we're in a position where it's like, okay, well, now we really need to focus on us. And, not to say we don't get into our little spirited debates often. But, at least the difference is now we'll come back afterward and say, hey, I noticed that this was what was really going on. I noticed that you responded this way. Could it be this, or, I'm sorry that I approached you that way. And we're kind of coming back together, and as opposed to just being like, angry and giving each other the cold shoulder for a couple weeks until finally one of us, we'll say one of us forgets it. I'm easy to forget and just move on. But that's what we do typically as men. It's our nature just to, stuff it and move on. But yeah, we got to grow. One way we can is to admit fault.
So you've mentioned your kids, your daughters, they're 7 and 9.
Yep.
So this is a weird question, but like the question is like, what's that like? How did you enter into that role of fatherhood after all that stuff that you guys had been through? And was this was after God wrecked you?
Yeah. So that was interesting. We were trying for a couple of years, and I remember the first time I was at this church and I prayed, I was like, God, what is it that you need to show me? And, please just show me what it is. Like, I need to know who you are. I need to know what you think of me. And I need to recognize you. And about a week later, my wife was pregnant. And in that, I felt God very clearly speaking to me, through the whole process of the pregnancy and having, when she was finally birthed. You won't understand my love until you understand the love that you have for your daughter. I'm like, okay. And then it's even more than that.
Right.
Like, okay. So I remember when the sad thing is about a week before my daughter was born, I fell back into, we'll say, an alcoholic situation. I wasn't going around and being like, like it wasn't like my normal thing. I got together with some old band members, and they were old band members with one of them was somebody that I didn't get along with very well. And for some reason, after having a couple of drinks, I thought it was a good idea in order to get back at him, I would just drink his entire fridge. So,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, obviously,
it's a bold strategy, Cotton.
Yeah, it didn't pay off. So basically, I was picked up immediately, like maybe a block away from his house, thank God, and pulled in, and I was arrested, and I was like, wow, my daughter, like I have a kid coming. Like, what am I doing? I'm an idiot. And it was a very sobering experience, I'll say, like pretty much right off the bat. I'm like, can you just take me to the station and I'll just like sit this off and we'll figure out what happened. No, they sent me to an actual prison because they didn't want to hold me in their cell. So that was wonderful. But I mean, thankfully in the end, it was, thousands of dollars I had to pay to get everything kind of straightened out. But the next morning after I was bailed out, I had about a half an hour to sleep before we had to get up and go to an all-day birthing class. And we were the only ones in the class. So there's this guy sitting there, smells like booze, passing out in front of the teacher who's like, this far. And I'm thinking like, she thinks I'm such a deadbeat dad. But I mean, God was so gracious even in that a week from that day, we had our first daughter, and somehow I retained all of the information in that class, and I was able to be a strong advocate for my wife and make, I'm like, oh, what are we thinking about Pitocin and this and that? And she's like, how do you remember any of this stuff? And I'm like, I don't know. What should we do here? And, here's some exercises that'll help. And, just, it's amazing, the grace that he still had for me, even though I made a dumb decision. So I hate to say like, I got rocked and then I did something dumb again, but we all do, right. we all sin. And whether it's a massive sin, whether it's a little sin, I mean, who's to say one of us couldn't just get up one day and accidentally murder somebody? The way I look at it is God still loved David and he made him king, and I'm not saying I'm a king or anything anywhere near as great as David was, but David made a lot of mistakes. And he had sin in his heart, even though his heart was for the Lord, his heart was also for him, because looking at everything with my child, my first daughter, I think the hardest thing was when we had our second daughter. My question was, how am I going to love this one enough? I already love my first one this much. Do I have any more love for another kid? And someone's like, oh, you'll have more love. I'm like, I don't understand it. You only have this much love. Now I have to split the love like that. Like, no, if you just get more. I'm like, okay. And I've seen that. It's amazing to witness that. I've got two, they're beautiful daughters. They're both very unique, very, very different from each other. And it's always an adventure. Every day is an adventure. And we do have a third girl who's homeschooling with us right now. So there are currently 3 kids running around upstairs somewhat quietly. I'm almost kind of nervous that they're quiet now.
Right. Yeah. You've done this long enough. You know that the quiet house is a nervous house.
Yes. We did a wonderful fire drill today. I've been doing fire drills at least once a month. And it's great. I set the alarm off and then just watch them all scramble. And today was a secondary route. And I explained to them the importance while I was gone of shoveling the back stairs off. The back stairs were not shoveled. I'm like, well, sorry, it's secondary route. So our fire drill was about 3 minutes and 30 seconds today. Not a good number. Because when they got to the back, they realized we can't go down there. I'm like, you're going to have to slide. And one of them, who's, we'll say, more physically challenged than the other one, just stood there whining about it. But I mean, hey, it's an experience. You got the younger one who's just like a little daredevil. She'll jump off the deck if she has to. And then the other one who will see a little bit of ice and she's like, I'm not touching it. But again, they both have their unique qualities, and it's amazing.
Yeah, you definitely get to see their stereotypes of firstborn, secondborns for a reason.
Yes. Yeah. And both my wife and I are firstborn. Well, I guess technically only born. I do have 2 half brothers because my dad remarried. But, with us both being firstborn, we have our particular ways of doing things. And I think that it actually makes our relationship somewhat challenging because we both desire the same thing from each other. So, and we're both very stubborn. So if we're both like, I want you to do this. Well, I want you to do this. I'm like, well, you're not doing it, so I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
It's obviously not the way to do it.
Right. That's the, I'm going to drink all the beer in his fridge. It's like, yeah, that ended up costing you more than that.
Yep.
But I think it's a interesting dynamic because you would ask God to show you, right? And who you were and all this and prep you for the birth of your daughter.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, you can screw up because we do.
Yep.
We go off the rails. It's, I was in my prayer and meditation time this morning and going through this thing, and the thing I'm reading and going through it was the Valley of the Dry Bones from Ezekiel.
Yeah. That heavy
and then
hard.
I turned the page and it's like, okay, you just read this. Where do you feel like your life needs water? It's interesting when you start sort of diving into all those things that you want to ignore, all the things that you sort of, yeah, God, I have these needs, but I kind of doubt you're going to show up.
Right.
And he loves us anyway.
Absolutely.
With that, and I'm pretty sure Chris said the same thing yesterday about his kid, that same idea of I love you, like the way that I love my child is the way that God loves me, but he does it a lot bigger and a lot better than I do.
Right.
And one of my friends, actually, his daughter-in-law is pregnant, and he says the same. He wants to tell his son, he's like, when you see that little girl, the way you feel about her is the way I feel about you.
Right.
Because I think that's a message that we need to hear a lot more, kind of grasp. I appreciate my parents, the older my kids have gotten. And right now I have 4 between 30 and 18. And so as they go through their adulting stuff, I look back at how I went through my adulting stuff, and I'm like, I don't understand how my parents were so patient because I want to strangle these kids.
Right. Oh, man. Yeah. Kids are a trip.
Yeah. They'll change your life for sure.
Absolutely.
God, as you mentioned, God still, he uses our marriages. He uses our kids. He uses our mistakes to help us grow if we're open to it, right?
Yeah, we have to be.
Because you could have just gotten pissed off, shame, condemnation poured on yourself of, like, you could have not gone to the birthing class because you're like, I've got half an hour of sleep and I've got booze seeping out my pores.
Yeah.
But you didn't.
No.
And that's super cool, man.
Yeah. My wife was so mad. And she was like, I'm leaving. And I'm like, you're not going without me. Yeah.
But that's cool.
Well, the interesting thing was when we had our kid, technically I couldn't drive. I couldn't drive for, I forgot how many months. And I'm like, well, we need to get you down there. I couldn't drive in that state. I could drive in my state, but I couldn't drive in that state. And I was like, oh wow, interesting. So I was able to get to work and everything. And I was like, that was a, whew. Thanks, wow. God. That was a little bit of grace that I shouldn't have gotten. But the hospital was in the other state. So she's like, you can't drive. I'm just like, they're not going to say anything. Like, if something happens, they're not going to say anything. I'm bringing you to the hospital. You're in labor. And she's like, no. So she actually went out, got in the car, drove the opposite direction because we needed gas, and then drove all the way down to the other state. And I'm like, man, like, she tells me she's not strong, but she's one of the strongest women I've ever known. She's amazing. She is absolutely incredible.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, we've talked more about your life and your story a lot more than we talked about Shema there at the beginning.
Yeah.
But any other nuggets, tidbits, anything that you feel like really it says like, I feel like if God's nudging you to share something or talk about something as we close the pod.
Well, I know one big thing that comes out of it is I think a lot of people throw out the baby with the bathwater. So when it comes to entertainment, when it comes to music, when it comes to TV shows and movies, it's like, so I do a podcast, Black and White Reviews. We're on all the platforms and everything as well, and we've been doing that for, I want to say we started in like 2019, so we've been doing it for a while now. One of the biggest things for me is like my buddy who I've been doing this with is one of my oldest friends, and he's not a Christian. And I am. So it's great that we have these kind of, I wouldn't say opposing views, but to see the views that are similar, when we talk about that. And then I'm able to kind of express, like, when I watch this, I see God's love through this situation. And, one big thing for me, like I've loved Star Wars since 97. I believe that's when they did the re-release, and they played it and they had it in theaters. I watched it a bit when I was younger than that, and I'm just kind of like, meh, and I walked away because it was like halfway through the movie, or midway through it, and I'm like, I don't know what this is. I wasn't interested. But then in 97, when they were coming back, I saw it in theater and my mind was blown. When we're getting ready for 99's Phantom Menace. And I'm like, this is great. And I had all the Star Wars Insider magazines. So as the years have gone on, I kind of became the resident Star Wars nerd. One of our podcasts, I started responding to them in Huttese, and they were like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I got this decoder, and I'm like reading Huttese. And I was the only one like still trying to hold on to hope, before the Acolyte and all that stuff came out. So I'm like, they might turn around. They might turn it around and come back. But Star Wars has always been a big thing. And I think the thing about the original, we'll say the original saga, just the original 6 films, leaving Rey out of it, because no offense, I know a lot of people rip on it and say it's the worst thing ever. It's not the worst thing ever. There are so many worse movies, and there are still some messages in there that are worth talking about. However, when I think Star Wars, those don't really come to mind. It's the original trilogy, and then you can add in, episodes 1, 2, and 3. And the story there is, I love the story of redemption that comes throughout the whole thing. One of the last movie nights that Sarah did, it ended up being, I think it was on my birthday. And she's like, what do you want to watch? It's your birthday. And I'm like, oh, well, Return of the Jedi. What a great story of redemption. You've got this opportunity to run to the dark side because it's easier. It's sin, just like everything else. And you've got this one being that is constantly saying, go ahead, give into it. You might as well, like, what else are you going to do? Just go ahead and give into it. And he goes, no, I'm going to stand on what's truth. And I'm going to, call out, my father who's been consumed by all this hate for all these years. And he does. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, but who hasn't seen that movie? But the concept of it is, it's such a great story. And to me, it all leads up to it, starting from episode 1 all the way to episode 6. I just wish that more people would look at that as an allegory, because I think it is, this maybe not just directly like an allegory to biblical scripture, but just to the reality of like anything can be redeemed. You mentioned the Valley of Dry Bones. First time I read through that, I bawled my eyes out because, I think back to my parents and the marriage that failed. And I'm like, no matter how dead something is, God can breathe life back into it. Muscles can grow back on dry bones, and everything can come back. And I'm in the middle of work, like, with my headphones on, just bawling my eyes out. And everyone's like, you all right? I'm just like, yeah, just God's good, and but I think that's something that we can lose. So my wife is a little bit more, we'll say, hesitant to watch certain things because it's like, well, this isn't pointing you to Jesus. I'm just like, but it could. Lord of the Rings, she's 100% for, because that's just an obvious allegory. Star Wars, it's going to take me a while to convince her of that one. The space wizards and all that, like, I get it. But I think there's a lot of movies where we can talk about it. And, I try to do this with the podcast without being too preachy, because that's not the point of the podcast. But we do have a third guy now who's also a Christian brother. So we kind of have that balance there, but it's good because when we get into our spirited debates, nobody at the end goes, I don't want to talk to them anymore. Like at the end, we're just like, I'm glad we had this conversation. This was fun to rip things apart and to kind of go through it. So I think, with this obviously being called Men of the Movies, I want to touch upon movies for a second and just say there's so many stories that, whether they're rated R, PG, PG-13, G, there are so many things you can pull out of a story that somebody made, whether or not they intended it to be speaking the truth of God. But God could have been working through them without them realizing it. I watched Bruce Almighty. Great comedy. Tom Shadyac did it, who also did the original Ace Ventura and a few other movies that, I love. Liar, Liar, he did that as well. But the guy got rocked by God and then did Bruce Almighty. And then he's like, that went well. Let me try Evan Almighty, which is very much just like straight from scripture. Here's what Noah did. Let's bring up Genesis and everything. And people didn't like that one as much because he went so far with it. I think it's a great movie. It's definitely not as memorable as Bruce Almighty because, he was being more respectful and not dropping F-bombs and flipping people off. And I'm like, yeah, but, I think I want to see a radical transformation that we already have seen a lot of people in Hollywood starting to come to the Lord. I mean, we can mention people that have just been stepping out. You've got Justin Bieber, who's up there giving honor back to the Lord. You've got, Russell Brand, who's been focusing all of his time now on just saying, like, I remember in the very beginning, he would like ask questions on his Instagram, just like, I'm reading this. What does this mean to you? Like he was hungry for truth, and I want to see more people who are involved in the entertainment industry really asking those questions and start wondering, asking why did God do this? Why am I here? What did God put us on this earth for? And I just don't want to see people missing the opportunities that God has. And right now, to bring it full circle, Shema is something I'm super pumped about because The Chosen was, I'll say this, I loved watching Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad ruined all TV for me because the story, the character development, the writing, the way it was shot, it was magnificent. Can I watch that movie now and or that show now and say like, oh, where was God acting? If I really dug, maybe. But, I think maybe at the very end, where he finally admits it was all for himself, coming to terms with reality. Sure, there's a positive message there, but none of that show was really positive. But as far as a show, The Chosen, for me, it hit all those nails like right on the head for me. And I was like, this is great. You've got great acting, great writing, great production. Character development is phenomenal. And I'm like, wow, I can finally enjoy TV again. So if someone's going to say, hey, we're going to make something and Shema and The Chosen is going to be, the inspiration for it, I am 100% on board. Let's make this, whether I'm in front of the camera, behind the camera, or just in the writing room, let me be involved.
Yeah, man, I love all the stuff you just said, especially about looking at, really paralleling Ezekiel with, I'd say the first 6, because really it's Anakin's story.
Right.
Is the 6th story is the story of Anakin more than anything.
Yeah.
Because he's the one who's ultimately transformed. And even though he's like, oh, he's more machine than man right now, is like, well, even the part that's man can still be redeemed and still come to life and still be restored. So, so check out your podcast, the Black and White Review.
Yeah, Black and White Reviews. Yep.
On all the channels,
all the fun stuff. Yeah, I primarily use Spotify, so I know it's definitely there. Spotify, YouTube. I think it's Black and White Reviews 1866. If you look us up on like Instagram and some of the other ones and Facebook, yeah, we're somewhere around there. They all need numbers because there's so many things to say Black and White Reviews. But
and then Shema you'll be working on over the summer.
Actually, in the spring, we're hoping to have it released in the summer.
Okay.
Yeah, we're shooting. We're going to be doing the majority of our shoot. Well, by the time this comes out, we've done some of it. But we're going to be doing the majority of the shoot in, I believe, June is our plan. And that shouldn't take too long. We managed a way to condense everything down. So as long as the weather permits, we can get it all done in probably about 4 days. So
Nice.
Yeah. 4 very full days.
Yeah. Yeah. And then sign up for their mailing list at refocuscreative.com/Shema, SHEMA. So Lee, thank you for coming on the podcast, for talking about not just the project that you're working on that's close to your heart, but really opening up your heart and sharing how God has worked through you and transformed your life.
Yeah, of course.
Because
Anytime.
those are the good stories. We don't like the tragedies. Like Breaking Bad, that's a tragedy.
Absolutely.
Because those are show of, but yeah, I've talked many times. It's like the tragedies are good because they show us what not to do.
Right.
But I much prefer the happy endings and the stories of transformation and redemption for sure.
Yeah.
And so thank you, Lee, for this. Like I said, you opened up your heart and your story to us. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
And so again, check out his podcast, check out the Shema. And this has been Paul McDonald and Lee Dickerson talking about life, not a movie, just about life. So hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you join us next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?